Hello, Opening Pathways viewers. It's great to be with you again. I'm excited to have Katie Radel with me, and Katie is the CEO and founder of Ripple Consulting Group. We're going to learn a little bit about that and a lot about Katie. Katie, welcome to Opening Pathways.
Thank you so much, Tom. I am incredibly excited to be here and to talk to you today.
Yeah, we are thrilled you're here. So I'm going to jump right in. I want to know, what was it that sparked your idea to start Ripple Consulting Group? And tell us a little about it as well, please.
Okay. Well, to back up a little bit, because history is important, I had many, many years in corporate America doing marketing, PR, some event planning, worked for large organizations, Fortune 500 companies, banking, healthcare, private equity, um, it, more of the serious industries, if you will, which I love. And it got to a point in my life where life had happened for me in a great way. I got married, I had my son, and I was actually on maternity leave. And I was going back to work at a hospital where I was doing marketing and PR from maternity leave. I went back and I actually was looking around physically, not, figuratively. And I'm like, I just can't do this anymore. This is not working. And when I say that, I mean how I felt when I was walking into the building, how I felt as a human being, and how I was showing up was not working at all. And I attribute that to being a new mother, first of all, but also I call it nearing 40. And I was going through what was the beginning of my midlife awakening, not crisis. We need to rebrand that. And I decided, I can't really do this anymore. So after about a year, it took me a minute to figure things out, as it does, but I decided to leave the corporate world and start my firm, PR firm, Ripple Consulting Group. I did not have a plan. And looking back, maybe that was a great thing because I didn't know what I didn't know. I just knew that I had to do something different. Looking back now, it's very clear that I'm wired to be an entrepreneur. I'm so grateful for my time in corporate America and all of my, learnings there and what it afforded me. But I knew that I owed it to myself to do something better and for me. And so I chose me and I started my business. Again, I didn't have a plan. I opened up kind of blindly of, well, I have had these wonderful corporate jobs and people will just follow me and it will be easy. And it was not easy because, first of all, I didn't really have a value proposition. What I would say to a lot of people when I was first starting my business is, I do marketing and PR. And let's just say that didn't land very well. And that was 100% a me problem. And also, I started my business 6 months before the pandemic. So it was a combination of unclear messaging, not really having a plan, and also horrible timing. But looking back, I'm grateful for it because I've now been in business for 7 years.
Yeah, I've heard this story a few times on this podcast of people that went out and then all of a sudden everything shut down. And it's a great, great example. All of these stories have been a great example of how whatever comes our way, we can achieve and find our way through it to the other side and thrive. So tell me this, was there a moment since you started it that you said to yourself, yeah, this is my man?
Mhm. I don't know if it's a specific moment. It's a series of specific moments all the time. And since I've been in business for 7 years, I have invested heavily into self development. We're talking therapy, yoga, walks, masterminds, any kind of group you can imagine that provides support, and really just continually learning about myself, when I first started my business, someone told me in the entrepreneurial world that being an entrepreneur is the most spiritual journey you'll go on. And at first I thought, no way, like, there's no way. But that has been 100% accurate for me. I have learned so much about myself along the way. And there have definitely been moments, the crying moments in the car of like, I can't do this anymore. This is so hard because, boy, being an entrepreneur is not for everyone. There are definitely moments where I've thought, the easy button to press would be to go back to corporate America and get that steady paycheck, healthcare benefits, all of those things. But every time I go down that path after a particularly hard lesson I've learned, I always go back to why. Why did I do this thing? And really, my why is freedom, freedom of choice, freedom of time. And when I think about my past self in a cubicle under fluorescent lighting, and when I say that, people who have worked in the corporate world are like, oh, yeah, that tracks. I cannot imagine myself there anymore. I feel allergic to it. And again, being an entrepreneur is not for everyone. And I have so much respect for, anyone who has joy and passion and sticks with the thing and is using their gifts and talents in ways that I hope everyone does. But for me personally, when I do face adversity with my business, I think back of like, why did you do this thing? Because you knew you were meant for more and you knew you could do it on your own.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It is a journey, and I know that for me, I thought I would miss the affiliation and building teams. And I remember that I had this revelation that I was working, doing some work for a company, and I was time for me to leave for the day, and everybody else wasn't leaving. And I had this memory of that was me that wouldn't have been leaving. And there was this thing of, yeah, they don't want me here after my number of hours. It was a kind of an interesting thing of, yeah, this works for me. But I think when we do it for ourselves, I've worked really hard in corporate America. I've had some pretty intense positions, and I think I'm working harder, but it doesn't feel the same, right? It doesn't feel the same when we're doing it. There's no one to lean over and share it with. Share the work with. There's no one to say, give me that by five. It's, give me that by five, talking to yourself. So it definitely is not for everyone. But for those of us that thrive on it, it can get through the transition. It's pretty powerful. So tell me this. I've learned on this podcast that I knew it before the podcast, but who we become in life, there's someone when we were very, very young that planted some seeds that grew whatever way they did. Who was that for Katie?
Hmm. Well, it's two things. It is a person and it's an environment that I grew up in. I grew up in a family that owns funeral homes. And I worked at the family funeral home when I was as young as 16 and could drive. I was working at the funeral home and I lived there for a little while as well above the funeral home, above in an apartment. And I would say it was modeled to me by my dad and my family that being an entrepreneur and owning a business was a possibility. It was a path. Now, I never really put two and two together until way after college, until this, what I call midlife awakening, where I realized, that path can be mine. I too can do that. And I've been given the tools and the gifts to be able to do that. So it was modeled to me at a young age that it was a possibility. Although I also grew up and it's tough. It's tough to have a family business, and in that industry, death doesn't wait. And it still doesn't. It's still in my family. So it was modeled to me that that was an opportunity or an option, but the environment in which I grew up in, being surrounded actually by the fragility of life, not just the idea, but the environment. I would walk downstairs from the apartment and there were visitations and funerals going on. And I always describe it as, I would smell lilies because that's a funeral flower. And I still smell it sometimes. And, there was like the coffee and people in suits being very somber and, doing all of the polite funeral etiquette, if you will. I grew up in that environment. And I didn't realize and put it together again until I was much later in life that that was such an incredible gift. And when I was thinking about who I wanted to be when I grow up and how I wanted to feel every day, I remembered back to all of the funerals that I had been to and worked at, and the families that had the absolute worst day of their life. And I've experienced my own grief, like we all have. And I remembered this important lesson that I was so lucky to have is that life truly is short. And I felt this accountability and responsibility to do better for myself and for my family. And that has really guided and shaped my life.
Hmm. Wow, that's an interesting perspective of life. I think I do a lot of talking about this idea because having been given 6 months to live 3 times, when you get in touch with death in different ways, you in one way, maybe me in another, but that getting in touch and we realize that whatever we might believe about the great mystery, life in this body is quite short. And I love to talk with people about, what are you going to do with it? What's the call you haven't made? What's the risk you haven't taken? And other things like that, which is interesting. And I do think those of us that have touched into that more in reality, appreciate and understand that this is a finite experience in this body anyway. So tell me this, Katie, what personal values have guided you from the start and which one has deepened lately?
Good and kind, period. Good and kind. And I thought of this as I was going through my transition, I guess, nearing 40. And legacy is something that would come up a lot when I would listen to podcasts or just, organically in conversations. What kind of legacy do you want to leave? And what does that look like? And again, kind of the whole theme of this life is very short. What are you going to do about it? Um, I thought to myself, good and kind is my true north, is my compass. And so ever since then, I've tried to live my life and conduct my business. Um, and it kind of goes along with branding. I guess you can relate it to that. I have a PR firm and I do a lot of personal branding for executives. But I want my brand to also be a legacy and to tie that together. And what that looks like is good and kind. So when there's a decision that has to be made, what is the right thing? What is the good thing? Is that a kind thing to say? Is that a kind way to live your life and to react? And so I try to use those guiding principles and values every single day. I'm not going to write all the time. Don't get me wrong, but that has been my true north. And what has deepened was your question, finding ways to be better, whether that's self-discovery, self-awareness, growing as a human, as an individual, leading better, leading my team better, leading my family better. It all kind of goes back to how can I be good and kind and better.
So tell me this, Katie, where has life asked you to slow down recently? And what did you hear?
There's a recurring theme. When I go for walks in nature, that is when I feel closest to me. And that is when things quiet down a lot because I have no choice. I have been working really hard and trying not to listen to podcasts and have noise in my ears, have my ears in. When I'm in nature, when I go for a hike, and in those moments, it's like I get this reminder of this voice or this intuition, this feeling of, see, that's better, isn't it? When you're walking and all you can feel is your movement and your thoughts. It can also be scary. When you have a brain that works really, really fast and you're, thinking of all the things you need to do and the checklist constantly, um, there's no escaping your thoughts when you're in nature alone.
Wow. So tell me this. What surprised you about who you became under pressure? We're in the pressure of our corporate life is different, but when you do this on your own, there's a different kind of pressure that comes because while you may be contributing in the corporate life to the bottom line, you're not the one that's really, it's not the same as when you're on your own and just the bills have to be paid or whatever. What surprised you about who you became?
It shouldn't have surprised me because I knew this all along. But what has surprised me the most is the simple answer of it's a me problem, usually. I say that because looking back on all the struggles and times where I felt, well, why didn't I go for that, or why did I do that thing, or why didn't I put myself out there, it can usually be traced to a me problem and me getting in my own way. And that goes back to that self-work, self-discovery. It saddens me because I do this work for my clients too, right? And I know you do as well. And you really have to sit back and examine, well, what went wrong there? And why didn't you take this opportunity? And why didn't you live bigger and take more risks? Well, it's usually a me problem. And it shouldn't have surprised me because gosh, I'm such a different person than I was when I started this business 7 years ago because of all the growth and change and adversity and all of that. And really life experience too. That's part of it. Um, but it can all kind of go back to a me problem and how I was showing up. And to continually work on that is the secret to success.
So tell me this. How has your relationship with risk changed since you started Ripple?
I've had to become a lot closer to risk. And I've had to befriend it because when I look at successful people, not just entrepreneurs, but people, um, what they all have in common, in my opinion, is they're people who are willing to take risks. And usually those risks are taking risks on themselves and having the courage and the wherewithal to do that. So my relationship with risk is ever changing and evolving, but it gets easier every day. The more I learn and the more I try to, dip my toe in the water of things, sometimes it works out beautifully. And I'm so proud that I tried. Sometimes it fails miserably, and that's okay too. What I go back to with risk and trying new things is when you're an entrepreneur, especially, but really in life, we all get the honor and the privilege to try some stuff. How cool is that? And the only thing stopping us is usually us.
Yes. Yeah, isn't that the truth? So tell me this. I have learned that some of my biggest mistakes led to my biggest successes.
Mhm.
Have you ever had a mistake that turned out to be a great success?
Yes. When I was mentioning when I first opened Ripple Consulting Group, I didn't know what I was doing, admittedly. And I don't think a lot of people do, to be fair, when they're first opening up and launching a thing. So you do have to try some things and see what sticks and what doesn't. But I made the terrible mistake of not being super clear, crystal clear on the value that I brought to clients and why choose me. And so I've even created a formula now. Looking back, I'm like, oh, I really messed that up for a while. And I actually speak to a lot of groups now about the mistakes that I made and how I turned it into, wow, I finally got clear on the mistake that I was actually making. And I turned it into, let's niche down and figure out this formula of how to communicate clearly. And I use that for my clients. It's like a litmus test I use. And it's, who do you help, the problem you solve, and the result. And everyone talks about an elevator pitch. And I want to rebrand an elevator pitch, because how many times do we actually get on an elevator and have the opportunity to tell someone, oh, I help so and so do XYZ. I like to rebrand it. I would like to rebrand it as, what is your zone of genius? Like, what could you talk about all day that no one else could talk about like you and have that passion? What does that look like? What does it really, really look like to talk about your business so people understand it clearly, so they can refer you and they have that light bulb moment of, oh, I know exactly what you do, and I can refer you business as well. So I love to use my own terrible example of communication, because I learned so much from it. And I like to say I built a business off of my big mistake.
Love this. Love this. So tell me this. How does Katie recognize when fear is information and not a stop sign?
I have to ask why. I have to say, that was an interesting feeling. I mean, really feel it in your body, feel it in your mind, go on a walk and really try to get to the root of why you're afraid of that thing. And again, it all goes back to, usually it's a you problem, or maybe there's some trauma there, but we all have the power to kind of look back and take an account of, what is this thing? What is getting in the way? Is it my past? Is it how I'm wired? Is it my personality? I don't know what that is, but really dig deep and try to figure out what that is. And usually, if you name the thing, actually say it out loud to someone else. Sometimes I'll just tell my husband, I am afraid to XYZ because I think that XYZ, and sometimes it just takes a loved one to point out the obvious and to say, okay, let's take it back a step. You've done this before. Why are you afraid?
Love it.
And that is our biggest enemy, and that is called imposter syndrome. I've battled imposter syndrome. We all have for a really long time. And I don't love to give airtime to imposter syndrome, but I've created a antidote to when I'm feeling stuck inside my head. And I'm like, oh, well, I'm afraid to do this thing because I might fail, or I'm afraid of success because. And I've created a very simple Word document. And it goes back to when I started my business 7 years ago. And every year, I don't know, maybe 6 months, or when I'm having a particularly awful day, I write down why I'm awesome. And it is proof, it is a proof point. And when you're in PR, you always look for data and a proof point for something to tell a story. I do that for myself. And that is my antidote to fear.
Yeah. I say this here often, and I think it's important to repeat it based on what you said of what I've learned about fear, which I bucket fear, this dreaded imposter syndrome that we've got so many books about and so many thoughts and everything. What I find true about them is they are simply opportunities for me. And I love what your husband said to you because so many of my clients, they're facing something with, and they forget their evidence. They forget what they've accomplished before. Because it's a new thing doesn't mean that you can't use what's happened from your past that you've accomplished to remember in those times to help give you a little, a little bolster behind it to move forward. So I love this idea that we're talking about. Tell me this, Katie, what are you most proud of? Not publicly, not professionally, but personally.
My family and what I've been able to create as far as our family unit and our family culture. It's just me and my husband, and we're raising this sweet little boy. And it always kind of goes back to your why. And he is our why, both of us. We're both on the same page, and I'm so proud of us. But mostly I'm proud of me and how I have shown up for my family. And thinking way back when I left the corporate world, my son was very young. I had just, had him, and he was only one. And the story makes me, cry sometimes when I tell it. But I was so caught up in achieving and climbing and all of those things that go along with performing in the corporate world. Again, it was, looking back, it was a me thing. The corporate
Yeah.
world is the corporate world, whatever that is, right? But it was how I was showing up, and I take responsibility for that now. But I wasn't my best self. Um, and I remember my sweet little boy, he's got this head full of hair, even when he was really little. And I remember coming home one day while I was in that environment and having this existential conversation with myself every day and holding him. And I smelled his head. I smelled his head. And I realized that I hadn't really done that before. And it was kind of all I needed to say, you need to smell his head. As silly as that sounds, you need to be in those moments and not miss this.
Yeah.
And I was just so exhausted. I was so burnt out. I was trying to navigate motherhood and life and achieving. I mean, all of these things that were just frankly impossible to get all 100% correct. And it goes back to how the environment I was raised in. And it was like, well, what legacy do you want to leave? If this goes down, if things go down, we never know, right? Will you have wanted to spend your time under fluorescent lights, climbing, or will you want to give yourself the freedom? And I chose me.
Good, good, good. What boundary has become essential in your sustainability?
It's really an internal boundary. And it's being self aware enough to know how things feel, how relationships feel, business relationships, personal relationships, all of it. If it doesn't feel good, don't do it. Don't do it. Hard stop. This life is too short. Don't do the things that make you miserable, unhappy. We've all heard of the Sunday scaries. I used to have them for years. I don't have Sunday scaries anymore. And so it's really just getting in tune with how you feel in your body and in your mind. And if something isn't jiving, you have to ask yourself why, going back to fear and, what is the root of this and why do I feel this way? But sometimes it is a stop sign. Sometimes it is a stop sign. And I think the more life experience you have, or at least I have, the easier those stop signs are to recognize.
Yeah, yeah. Katie, have you ever said no to growth because it wasn't aligned?
I don't know if I've ever outwardly said no to growth, but I've said no to potential business relationships or clients that were not aligned with me. And again, going back to how you feel, getting better at discerning what is a good fit, discerning those red flags that you might get. Even some of, people are calling them yellow flags or beige flags, listening to those as well. And I think it goes back to intuition. We are built with this internal compass. How cool is that? I think about that all the time. How cool is it that we as humans are walking around with this compass and it's an intuition? And if we listen to that compass and intuition, it will help guide us, make better decisions that are right for us and more aligned. And when we ignore it, that's another sign and signal of like, well, maybe you need the revenue now. When you're a business owner, it's true. It's just, it's part of it. Sometimes you just need the revenue, even though you know better and you know it might not be a good fit. That intuition is saying and getting louder and louder, saying, I don't know if this is a great idea. And it gets louder and louder. And if you ignore it and choose to ignore it, you're doing that for a reason. So it's all about paying attention to that intuition. And are you shoving it down and ignoring it blatantly, or are you using it as a clue, a guide, information? Knowing the difference.
Katie, what have you learned about trust since you've been in this path with Ripple Consulting Group?
I've learned that it's always easy to trust people at first, but they will show you who they are. They will show you who they are, and you have to pay attention to that. I like to call that, and a lot of people in the HR world use this, but I tried to apply this to my life. Hire slow and fire fast. I'm trying really hard to apply that to my life as it relates to actually hiring people to be on my team. It could look like hiring clients, firing clients. And that goes for relationships as well. So hire slow, fire fast.
Yeah, some great wisdom for people who are responsible for certainly hiring people because, as you and I both know from our background, it costs so much more when you don't hire correctly and you do it in a rush. You'll always pay for it, whether it's a week, a month, or a year later, you're going to pay for it. And to take that time, and in our crazy world of businesses, we feel like we have to fill that hole right away. And then the opposite of that is, as you well know, when we let people linger and we think we're giving chance after chance, we often forget as managers and leaders of what it's doing to your highest performers as they're watching that happen and where our attention is. So there's some great wisdom for people listening today. What does renewal look like for you? Beyond just the take a few hours off, take a day off, or rest. What renews, Katie?
First and foremost, being in nature, having that quiet time without my ears in, without the podcast going or music going. That is, I heard or read somewhere at some point, if you're having a really, really awful day, just stop and go for a walk for half an hour and see how you feel after. 99% of the time, you feel a lot better. And I have found that to be true. So it's being still, being quiet, going in nature. But renewal for me is also, what are your hopes? What are your dreams? What is that, bucket list that everyone calls it? What does that look like? And are you going to be satisfied? And asking yourself really hard questions of, are you going to be satisfied if you don't write this book, or if you don't grow your business, or if you don't repair this relationship, whatever that looks like? Asking pretty big questions about my life, and using that as a roadmap. I think that's what renewal looks like, other than, being alone in nature and spending time with my family, going on adventures.
I love this. I'm curious to know, Katie, if a much, 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 much younger Katie were watching this podcast or recording, what would you tell her?
It's going to be just fine. Um, I love the quote. I don't know where I got it from again. I'm always reading and collecting these quotes that speak to me, but this one really spoke to me, and it's right on brand for this podcast. It's, create a life and do the things that would make your 5-year-old self proud and your 85-year-old self proud. And when I think of my 5-year-old self and what that looks like, it means joy and fun and laughing. I laugh a lot. It's just part of who I am. I'm an extrovert, and I like to have fun and be the life of the party, and be silly and weird, and, embrace that. And I think that would be really fun and cool for a 5-year-old to see. And she would look at me and say, I like her, and she's fun, and I want to be by her, and she feels warm. She feels warm to be around, and it's part of legacy too. Good and kind and warm and fun and full of life and joy.
Love this. So here's what I'd like to know for our final question today. I'd like to know what your boldest vision is for Ripple Consulting Group, and I'd love for you to tell us how we find you.
Yes. My boldest goal and ambition for Ripple Consulting Group is to really double down in the healthcare space, particularly in the hospice and palliative care space. I have a huge passion for those areas, probably because I grew up in a funeral home. And just how I live my life, I am drawn to organizations that help people towards the end of their life, give them dignity, and support them in a time that a lot of people are afraid of. And I've really had this big goal and vision really within the last few months. I've gotten clear on what that looks like. And to me, it's not pivoting per se, because it's still, doing my core offerings, PR and thought leadership and executive visibility, but it's getting more into a space that I'm so passionate about, I can't contain myself. And I feel within my bones that I'm on the right track.
Love that. Love that. Katie Radel, thank you for being on Opening Pathways today. You've shared a lot of wisdom with the viewers, and I've enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you.
And to my viewers, this is Tom Lenoble. I'll see you next time.